My name's Stuart Gill. I'm the Master of Queen's College, and it's wonderful to have everyone here this evening on this very important topic that we're going to be discussing about climate change. This is part of a series that we've started to do each year. This year it's been great to get back to being face-to-face, but the Sugden Institute is something that we created just prior to us going into COVID. I won't say much about it because there are flyers in the back of the room that explain what the Sugden Institute is about. And for anyone that's not familiar with Queen's, we also have some booklets at the back about Queen's. As we come to this topic tonight, I'm looked at what the First Nations Assembly, the First Peoples, had to say about this area. And I read that Indigenous peoples are caretakers of the earth and realise and respect her gifts of water, air and fire. First Nations peoples have a special relationship with the earth and all living things in it. This relationship is based on a profound spiritual connection to the earth that guided Indigenous peoples to practice reverence, humility and reciprocity. It's also based on the subsistence needs and values extending back thousands of years. Everything is taken and used with the understanding that we take only what we need, and we must use great care and be aware of how we take and how much of it, so that future generations will not be put in peril. I thought that was a nice statement to think on as we think about climate change this evening. And in that context, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present, and particularly to acknowledge Professor Marcia Langton, who's with us here this evening, and any other Indigenous people who are here. In a recent survey from the University of Western Australia of young people in Australia between the ages of 7 and 25, 96% identified climate change to be a serious problem, and 89% were concerned about the effects of climate change. The survey also showed a link between climate change and young people feeling anxious, depressed, and disempowered. There's probably no more important issue for us to be looking at this evening than climate change. And we're in very good hands with a former member of this community, still a member of this community, Simon Torrick. Simon is a founder and co-director of Scientel. He spent decades both in Australia and overseas helping researchers, research agencies, governments, and other organisations explain and translate the work that they do and the importance of science in our lives and its role in understanding the environment. He's an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. He's on the advisory board of Monash University TV weather presenters. And we had hoped to have Rob Gell with us this evening, who I think everyone knew as a weather presenter, but unfortunately he had to pull out for other commitments. He's also on the expert advisory committee of the Australian Institute of Performance Sciences. He's a member of the Australian Science Communicators and the Ecological Society of Australia. He completed a PhD in climate change science at the University of Melbourne and has a graduate diploma in science communication from the Australian National University. He's made numerous appearances on television and radio and performed science shows around Australia. Perhaps most importantly, he's a Wyvern from 1986, and I think was a member of the college boat crew from 1986 through 1989. So it's appropriate, Simon, I did look today, and you're not actually up there, but it's appropriate that we're meeting here with the oars. And tonight, Simon is channeling Jeffrey Robertson for us. For the younger members of the audience who may not know who Geoffrey Robertson is, he's someone that ran Hypotheticals for years on the ABC. So we're in very capable hands. I hand over to Simon Torrick.
Thank you, Stuart. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Climate Change 2037, Time to Act. As Stuart implied, we can't look to the future without acknowledging the past, so I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, including Professor Langton. I think, particularly in light of tonight's topic, it's important to acknowledge the legacy of tens of thousands of years of climate knowledge, expertise in maintaining the cultural landscapes on country and protecting the environment. And before we get going hypothetically, I'd also like to state a few other facts. The world's climate has changed. It's going to continue to change in future, and it's going to have some significant impacts. Hence, action on climate change is required. We need to act. Now, when I was at Queen's in the 1980s, carbon dioxide concentrations were less than 350 parts per million, but now carbon dioxide concentrations are at 415 parts per million, and the world has warmed by over a degree. In other words, climate change is real, but the event tonight is not. It's hypothetical, we're making it up as we go along, and just like a long-term climate change projection, really, we don't know exactly what path it's going to take. That's going to be up to our panellists up here on the stage, who, rather than acting on climate change, are actually going to be acting. And for that reason, I need to point out right from the start that the views expressed by our panellists may not necessarily be those of their real selves or the organisations they work for. If they are, it probably won't be as funny. So now I'd like to transport you into the future. It's 2037, the 150th anniversary of Queen's College. Carbon dioxide levels now are well on their way to doubling their pre-industrial concentrations. The world's warmed much more than was predicted back in the 2020s. Newspapers no longer exist, so social media is filled with stories of all the extreme weather that's going on in Melbourne. In fact, it's so warm and humid in Melbourne that our climate in 2037 is more like that of Brisbane's. Weather systems are moving south, and in fact things have moved so far south that Tasmania even has an AFL football team. So to discuss what to do about the crazy climate of 2037, I'm honoured to be joined today by several eminent people who may look familiar to you, but whose career paths have taken them along some surprising turns over the past 15 years. Where will we start? You've sat in a different order to what I was going to introduce you to that. Well, maybe to start with, on my right here is David Hyatt. And we're really fortunate to have David join us on the panel because he turned up tonight thinking he was going to be in the audience. But due to one of the panellists pulling out, he stepped into the role of Director of the Carbon Market Business, Southern Union for Global Deals in Emissions from Nature, or Sugden, as it's better known. So ever since the Australian government set a 43% emissions reduction target in the 2020s, the Southern Union for Global Deals in Emissions from Nature has been at the forefront of taking people's money so that they can feel less guilty about polluting the planet. So thanks for that service that you provide, David. Next we have Professor Marcia Langton, the first female Indigenous President of the Republic of Australia. Some saw Professor Langton's move, yes. Now you may think that Professor Langton's move from academia into politics would actually be a step down, but she said she was sick of politicians being all talk and no action, and so she's really now making things happen right across the Republic. Next up, we're fortunate to have Australia's chief scientist, another Wyvern, Dr. Linden Ashcroft. Linden is an expert in climate change and enjoys discussing extremes in weather events and the impacts, the severe impacts they have. And so, therefore, this prophet of doom is rarely invited to dinner parties. And we're fortunate to have Linden here tonight because, as you can see, she's actually meant to be at home making arrangements for her 15-year-old son's birthday, which I think is tomorrow. The next person along the line here is the new Master of Queen's College, Evangelia Wichmann. So welcome, Master. After a career addressing social justice issues, particularly women's rights and global inequalities, Evangelia became the first female Master of Queen's and is committed to changing, well, the name of the position at least. And finally, a journalist seems to have made it up onto the stage, even though we tried to bar him at the door. So we're now, I guess, obliged to welcome Walkley Prize winner Dan Ziffer. Dan also went to Queen's in the 1990s, and after having a successful career at the ABC, Dan sold out and now presents the Climate Skeptics show on Sky News. And as I think you heard earlier, my name is Jeffrey Robertson. Well, time flies. It's 2037 and global average temperatures have risen by almost 3 degrees, way above the upper limit of the Paris Accord target of 1.5 to 2 degrees. So just like all those people who had to cancel their European holidays back in 2020 due to COVID, the whole world has now missed Paris. Climate change has had many impacts. For example, many of the wineries in the Yarra Valley have shut down. So the wines that you had tonight were from the Australian wines from the cool climate region of Moreton Base, Antarctica. Extreme events are very common now. We've had severe storms this week and massive downpours over the CBD. Dumped so much water it was enough to fill the MCG. And in fact, the MCG did fill with water, causing the cancellation of this week's AFL Night Grand Final. So, Linden, with all these extremes, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other changes in climate that Melbourne is experiencing in 2037?
You're right, Jeffrey. These changes that we've seen in the last 15 years have been faster and more dramatic than even the most depressing projections that we had 15 years ago. We're seeing 50 degrees reached every summer now. We've got heat waves. We actually have a decrease in the number of heat waves, which is good, but that's because all of the heat waves are linking together now. And so we'll have 2-3 week heat waves, which, as you all know, because you're all here with us in 2037, is really overwhelming our health system. The downpours that we're getting are short and sharp and deadly, and the beautiful metro tunnels that we finally got about 3 weeks ago are now flooding completely. And constantly, which is great for the rowing crews, but really hard for the trams and the trains. We're also seeing a real increase in humidity, which again is good for I would say, the quantity of plants that we're growing, but not the quality. Obviously, with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're getting our plants growing faster, but they're not giving us as much nutrients. So all of that sort of market garden and small garden and small businesses that really took off in the early 2020s after the COVID times, the sea times, they're just not bringing as much nutrients as we wanted. And we can't go up north anymore to get our food because it's drier up there, and the swings between wet and dry and monsoon and not monsoon are even worse. We're getting fewer tropical cyclones now across Australia, which is good, but when they come, obviously, they're devastating. Of course, we had Tropical Cyclone Simon in 2032 that just absolutely decimated the Gold Coast and then moved down and smashed into Sydney as well, which of course we weren't expecting, and we're still cleaning up after that. So
it sounds like there's a lot that we need to adapt to, a lot of extremes.
There's a lot.
We need to adapt for eternity, and in fact Queen's College's motto is "Edif Calms in Eternum," build for eternity. So unfortunately, one of the final building activities that the former Master Stuart Gill made was an extension of the wood panelling of the junior common room throughout the college. So when Melbourne had its first day over 50 degrees last summer, the whole place went up like a match. So, Evangelia, as the current Master of Queen's, you're now having to rebuild again for eternity. To adapt to the climate of today, how are the new buildings different to those of 15, 20 years ago?
Well, now we don't really build for eternum anymore. We now build for adaptability. We have to build our buildings up and down all the time with the cyclones. We have also started building underground because with the heat waves, the students cannot study because it's just too hot. But we have some great engineers and students in our student cohort, and we work with our Wyverns to really use like the new science and technology to use underground and get rid of the water that we then funnel into the new tunnels, and then the students get more rowing practice, as you said. But yeah, no, it's all about building up and down because we just can't deal with like structures. Like the north building is gone. So our first structure opened, 1877 is gone. But yeah, education continues and we go underground.
Well, it's great that you're looking to the future as well as sort of acknowledging the past. And I guess along those lines, I'd like to turn to President Langton. Queen's is doing its best to manage in a world of extremes. And Australia's First Peoples had tens of thousands of years of expertise in managing a land of extremes. Have other Australians turned to Indigenous knowledge to learn about adaptation, and how are you making that sort of knowledge available?
Well, unfortunately, the experiments to prove that Indigenous knowledge about fire turned in their results too late to make much of a difference because, you know, as you know, Canberra's burnt to a crisp already with the bushfires, and, you know, I had hoped that that very early Royal Commission into natural disasters and, you know, after the Black Summer of 2019, well, you know, that's so long ago now, and the Royal Commission made recommendations about including Indigenous knowledge in responses to the wildfires, but the scientists were too slow to take it up. But the good news is that the Aboriginal Ranger programs across the country have continued with their fire management regimes, their cultural burning. The problem is, of course, that you know, already there's 150,000 climate refugees from the Pacific, and many of them have come to Aboriginal lands because they're not welcome in the cities. Unfortunately, Australians voted for a government that doesn't believe in climate change, which is, you know, which has caused really some huge demographic shifts. And it appears that most of the Aboriginal lands are taking in more and more climate change refugees, not only from the Pacific, as I say, 150,000 already, and we're expecting another 150,000 in the next 10 years, but also from the towns and cities of Australia where, you know, they've simply cooked themselves. There's no water. Townsville, for instance, is, you know, in dire straits. It's dried up altogether. And there are other towns like Townsville where the water supply has disappeared because of the desiccation, the drying of that part of the world. But then where you have too much water, they're not ready for it, they're not prepared for it, and so there are refugees from the areas where there are frequent floods. They've lost their houses, they have no electricity, their sewage systems don't work, and so in all of those areas where Aboriginal people have been keeping their biodiversity by managing the land and, well, for all sorts of reasons, maintaining small populations, they're now becoming inundated with refugees and trying to find a way to build economies for these people without losing Aboriginal values and of course, you know, particularly the value of preserving the environment and our biodiversity in particular. So we face big challenges, and as the President of Australia, I can't attend only to those problems, and I'm afraid that all my messages about adapting quickly to climate change, it's falling on deaf ears, where we have industries that refuse to stop using fossil fuels.
Well, as far as the deaf ears go, perhaps part of the blame can be put on the media. Now, Dan, your news outlet is still banging on about there being no need for action on climate change, especially after the US dropped its commitment to the Paris Agreement during Donald Trump's second term as president, a term that he served out in his final days at Guantanamo Bay. So does the media have a role in educating the public about the science of climate change and the need for action, and are you responsible for so much inaction?
I think, apart from all the whinging, it's going quite well. I was reflecting on this recently as I live streamed my show in from my high-rise apartment on the Lawn Coast, where most of the Gold Coast has moved since, you know, those events occurred that we don't talk about very much in Queensland that made it less able to be lived in. And I was reflecting on what a benefit it was that we'd received so many Queenslanders back in Victoria after the 2024 to 2025 lockdown ordered by Premier for Life Andrews. And thinking about the lifestyle that we've been able to gift so many people. Obviously the humidity is an issue, and I have hair products that can deal with that. But just the joys of being able to take the children from my third wife to Movie World in Horsham, where you see a climate that is lush and green and able to provide for the many more people who now live in our wonderful state. So it did reflect on it that there's certainly always going to be disagreement about climate change. It's ongoing. Even I heard the President recently just speaking about, you know, in some areas there's too much water, in some areas there's not enough water. You just can't please some people. And, you know, I think that adaptation keeps going, as we've seen from, you know, Melbourne University's move to go completely underground, digging the car park another 46 stories under. So, you know, and making the most of those opportunities. I mean, sure, people used to live in Elwood and now they water ski there. But, you know, that's a really great opportunity for the suburbs around Elwood, which are now above the waterline, to really capitalise on. So there's a lot of criticism levelled at the media, but I think it's very simplistic because it's a very complex issue, and I'd hardly say that it's settled yet.
Okay. Well, lots of examples of adaptation there. I might go to you, David, from the business perspective. How are businesses holding up to all these extremes on climate change? What's business doing to adapt?
Thanks, first of all, for inviting Sugden to this esteemed forum. It's great to be here and to be speaking to everyone. Sugden is about solutions for climate change. And if you go to our website, you'll see that we've been carbon neutral since 2030. And also all of our Porsches have been electric vehicles since 2030 as well. So if I can put it to you this way, that carbon credits are like a permission slip for emissions. And it does sound bad, but it's not really, because it's a mechanism to join buyers and sellers together. So the bad guys can give some of their emissions to the good guys. And we're creating a market. And of course, Sugden's doing quite nicely out of it, but we've put a lot of IP into this system. We really have set up something to join these buyers and sellers together. So business is doing their bit. And thanks, Dan, for the pump up you gave me in your podcast. It really has lifted sales. It's really handy. But I think that business is lifting their weight. So, you know, I'd challenge anyone who said otherwise, because we really are part of the solution, and taking action by making this buying and selling system work is so important.
Well, speaking of electric cars and business, it was interesting to read on social media that the body of Elon Musk is yet to be retrieved from Mars, where he was driving his electric Tesla. so we won't be hearing from him, although I've heard that his company, Twitter Space, is planning a mission to go and collect his body. But electric cars are out there, and despite the government's best intentions, in the year 2037, it's just as well we've got lots of electric cars, because petrol is now at $8 per litre, or $7.96 if you've got a supermarket docket, just to take the edge off. So were electric cars enough to reduce emissions? Chief Scientist Linden, you were advocating electric cars back in your days as a younger scientist. Have they played their role?
I've been advocating for a long time, and my predecessor in this chief scientist role, Bindi Irwin, she was also advocating for them. And we advocated, but business didn't listen. Business didn't listen fast enough. The media slowed us down. We were more excited about self-driving petrol cars than we were about electric cars. The government was slow. Government before the current government really slowed things down. And it wasn't enough. Again and again and again, people just didn't listen to us scientists. Maybe we had our arms crossed too tight, but it's too late now. We've done a lot of damage because the science just wasn't listened to. Electric cars wasn't enough. We needed every sector to decarbonise, not pretend to decarbonise and actually just buy and sell trees that ended up being chopped down.
And maybe we put too much investment into electric cars rather than microphone technology, which really hasn't progressed far in the last 15 years. But Evangelia, your generation must hold a few grudges about what's been left to you, not just the burnt out shell of Queen's, but the rest of the planet. What would you want to say if you had the chance to really travel back in time 15 years to the generation that should have acted much more back in the 2020s?
Yeah, well, I think the opening question was, why was our future too expensive for you? You talk about business, but this business is unethical. Queen's for the first time has disassociated itself with Sugden because the business model is not ethical enough, that the student body, which follows the Sugden tradition, voted against Queen's buying into your deal. And I think the student body is at a point where we are uncomfortable. Well, I as master, of course, get my house, that's still above ground, but the students are underground and they are uncomfortable. And I think they also have no choice. They can no longer go to Paris because there's no flights for them. They no longer can go to the laboratories and use materials to study things because we can't. There are no materials. So the generation of students that's incoming is angry, and they do not have the liberties that your generations all had when you guys had the option to make change. So I think, well, other than anger and disappointment, there's hopelessness. And I think we are sick and tired of business deals, mining companies sponsoring governments, scientists not having the adequate enough voice to go speak to governments, and also, what are we doing with all these climate refugees? Where are they being hosted? What is with all these hundreds and thousands of years old of culture and tradition? Where are you talking about them? Where's the media coverage?
Well, how are you covering this sort of story?
Well, I'm glad you talked about hopelessness because, yes, young people, I agree with you. Absolutely hopeless. And never am I more depressed than when I walked through the university, as I did here on the way. I went past the old geology building. Obviously, it's geology. Of course it's the old, but why do they even need to say that, much less teach it? I look at the despair that I have when I see young people complaining about these issues rather than dealing with them. We had the same issues when I was younger. We were dealing with 3% interest rates. These challenges have existed before. I don't understand why young people are so angry when they have the ability to go and, if they want to change things, they can do so. But to try and just hamper business who are just out there, making lazy millions a year per executive, is really a reductive and very simple kind of boogeyman, as though they've caused all the problems, when, as we know, it's all of us and it's the decisions that we've all made that have contributed to this large global problem, which I certainly don't want to do my part to fix.
I feel like endorsing those remarks because we're just giving the people what they want. Business only exists to serve the people. And the things that you buy, the things that you want in your shopping bag, are the things we supply. So, and we're also doing it and moving our emissions around, so that's a bit win-win.
Well, so it is, sure, up to the people, but it is also up to the system as a whole to lead. And the whole system of the world did respond very quickly to COVID way back in the 2020s, as well as to the subsequent 3 pandemics that we've had since then. And in fact, I think you've just come back from having your mandated 74th booster shot for COVID. So the world did respond to global pandemics, but it just doesn't seem to get its act together when it comes to reducing emissions, or it hasn't over the last 15 years or so. Even when the target was set for Australia at 43%, we missed that target by 200%. And globally warming, as I mentioned before, is right up at 3 degrees. So what do we need to do to reduce net emissions? Because I know that's your business, is to look not just at reducing emissions, but reducing the net impact of emissions by sucking up carbon. How do we continue to do this, and have we missed the window to really get to net zero by 2050?
Well, I think we have done lots of things. So the industry's been helping with the transition. We've now got offshore wind farms as far as the eye can see in Gippsland. We've now got new transmission. So I think we are pulling our weight in business, and we are finding those solutions. So, you know, are you sure your numbers are right?
Well, you mentioned these offshore wind farms. They're off the coast of Victoria. We do have these giant turbines the size of the Eureka Tower now off the coast of Victoria. But unfortunately, one of them fell over, causing a tsunami onto the Victorian coast that added to sea level rise. So, Evangelia, one of the adaptation responses of the City of Melbourne to sea level rise and that tsunami was to invest in an initiative called the Great Wall of Fisherman's Bend. To pay for it, they've introduced a levy. But is that fair? Is building a wall even the right way to adapt to these changes? And is it equitable to have a wall that divides communities?
Definitely not. But I think, is it too late? Do we have a choice?
Well, we certainly need to be adapting, but maybe extending wood panelling throughout the college, for instance, is similar to building a wall. It may be an example of maladaptation. So we certainly have to adapt to the extremes that we're seeing, but they need to be in a form that doesn't cause more damage. Maybe the Chief Scientist has something to say.
Yes, if I can interrupt, Jeffrey, there was time to mitigate. There was time to reduce these impacts. There was time to act. That time was the 2020s. If it wasn't going to be the 2010s or the 1990s or the 2000s, it was the 2020s. That was the time to act. But instead of acting, we let business and we let the media run the show rather than the science that said this is what we need to do and this is what we need to do right now. The quicker we act, the easier the transition will be. That didn't happen, and now we're here in 2037 dividing communities and trying to adapt with more and more engineering-based solutions where the science of Western science as well as traditional knowledge is being ignored. The science of communication and social science and working together is being ignored. The role of the chief scientist is, you know, you don't invite me to any of the dinner parties. You don't invite me to any of the conversations. These chats we're just not a part of anymore, and that is why these walls will keep being built. These turbines that have been poorly designed will keep falling over. We'll have humid summers up in Horsham at the Gold, whatever it's called, some place where fun people go. But in the wintertime, it'll be so dry there that there'll be tumbleweeds everywhere because it doesn't rain in the winter anymore here in Victoria. And that's because we left it too late.
Well, there was a lot of talk and no action, and I guess that was something, President Langton, that you've managed to change. I remember back in the 2020s there was a lot of talk, particularly in Indigenous affairs, around a voice to Parliament, a treaty and so on. What was it that led to real action in that area, if there was real action over the last 15 years, and what can others in the climate area learn from that?
Well, it was unfortunate that the referendum was lost, mainly because of the Sky News broadcasts, which were constant and, you know, devious. But anyway, there was a good outcome, and that was we established the voice in any case without constitutional enshrinement, and just as well because the iteration of the voice that I've been dealing with has been very useful. In fact, I'm convening them as my Emergency Advisory Council in order to deal with the climate change impacts. I've invited a few non-Indigenous people, some experts and some wise heads to contribute as well. Their advice is always welcome. Unfortunately, of course, they want to have it. They always say on the one hand and then on the other hand, and we sit there waiting for some decisive advice and we never get it from them. So we've taken matters into our own hand, and I've used my emergency powers to put a number of resolutions to my Emergency Advisory Council. So, I can share with you one of them that I'm allowed to make public at this stage, because we do want to consult with the public on it. And that is ensuring that every Australian who's made homeless by climate change impacts is provided with a safe accommodation of some sort. Now, it might be a shipping container, but it's unfortunate that these shipping container communities are starting to look like refugee camps. But in any case, people need roofs over their heads, and there are now so many climate change refugees, as I say, from many of our own communities, from many of the suburbs of Melbourne, and elsewhere. You've referred to, the immigrants from Queensland. Well, they've completely lost their houses. All of the, Sanctuary Cove and those marina developments are completely underwater. Their houses were wrecked by king tides, flooding, and of course the cyclones. So there wasn't enough housing in Melbourne, even for our own populations. So I've declared several areas emergency accommodation areas. I've had to take over several Defence Force facilities for these shipping container communities. I've done the same in our coastal cities, in parts of Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, Darwin, and of course, I've moved a great proportion of the population of Townsville and Cairns up into the ranges and taken over the airstrips up there. So, we do want the public to comment on my proposed emergency declarations. I think it's very important that people have a say about where these refugees are going to live. Obviously, we have the NIMBY factor, not in my backyard, so the only solution was then to build these communities. We will upgrade the shipping container housing in time. Of course, that's the cheapest option at the moment, with most of the world's shipping and supply chain damaged by various economic events that also result from climate change. But I'm finding it a very great challenge, but I am so grateful to the Voice, which I've convened as my Emergency Advisory Council, and very grateful to those people who want to participate, who are not from our community. But I will say this, one of the great advantages is that we have the best rugby teams in our Aboriginal communities now because of the Pacific refugees. So, form a team, come and play.
Well, it sounds like some great interventions and initiatives that have really made some changes, unlike 20 years ago, 15 years ago. But it was like the government responding quickly to COVID, that you've managed to respond quickly to this crisis of housing and refugees. Speaking of COVID, climate change and health has been a big issue. Chief Scientist Linden Ashcroft, how have you been advising the government to respond to the crisis in health due to climate change?
Well, as much as they'll listen to me, I've been advising them to keep listening to me and keep listening to other experts, not only in climate science, but medical science and communication science as well. As I keep saying, these issues are spanning our society and they need every single one of us. You know, my department's been saying this for a very long time. Of course, we know we have malaria extending now further south across the continent. We've got these heat-related fatalities that are occurring most summers now, even with an enhanced warning system. Our weather forecasts, you know, you still can't trust more than 7 days, but we do know when a heat wave is coming up to 10, 12 days in advance, thanks to some investment in supercomputers by some governments a long time ago. But
I think the quantum computing was pretty helpful with the weather forecast precision.
I think the data breaching and the giving up of any kind of privacy maybe counteracted the value of the quantum computing, but it did improve our forecast by a couple of days, which was pretty good. Yeah, that was pretty good. But the health crisis is worsening. Not only we're still recovering from pandemic after pandemic, you know, there was that pig disease and then that other bat disease and then of course these different mosquito-borne diseases that we can't even escape from now up in the hills. You know, you talk about our refugee communities up in the highlands in Queensland and even up in the Alps, you know, we've got those mosquito swarms that come every summer now. They've decimated the bogongs. They've, you know, finished off the last of the pygmy possums. Not to mention the health of all our humans as well. So look, we're doing our best, but every summer brings with it another round of catastrophes, and our system can only cope so much.
Well,
and extinctions, and it's the worst part of my job to announce the extinctions. So koalas became extinct officially, I think, in 2030, and since I've been appointed to this role, I think I've announced about 2,500 extinctions, and I make a point of making the extinctions public in speeches that I give. I gave a speech here at Queen's College where unfortunately I had to announce 200 extinctions. But thanks very much for the lab-produced lunch. It was very nice.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those were annoying insects that became extinct, so I know publicly that didn't cause too much problems, but when the koala disappeared, I think that managed to cut through to public opinion and that things were really looking bad. So David, as far as that public opinion and doing something about things go, did that affect people's reduction in emissions, or are they still coming to you to invest in offsets and training?
Well, they're still doing it, but it's because it brings in money. All the things we've heard talked about require money. So you need buying and selling, a market, you need business. These are the solutions that bring money to solve the problems we've heard talked about here. Housing, as the President said, and also extinctions. I also am pretty hurt by what the Master said about Sugden. And I'm just hoping you reconsider our offer to sponsor the Queen's Ball. I know you've rejected it, but we think we can get Gang of Youths out of retirement. They're pretty old, I know. So I'd like you to reconsider, please.
Is that on the table?
Well, the ball has actually stopped due to the student disengagement in spending money for, well, self-indulgence, and now instead we actually do camps that go to the refugee camps, and we set up housing, and the students actually learn there some, do advisory groups, because we've learned about the inequalities that are actually set up in these refugee camps because they have to be built up so quickly, because the government was not prepared for these camps. So actually, instead of the ball, we'd love some funding to help bring all our students over there, because it is quite a competitive trip at the moment for students to go and learn about these things.
Count us in.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't know if I would reconsider doing a deal with you, but funding we can always take.
Well, we've heard a bit about offsets there and also about all the extremes, but I guess the big story as far as reducing emissions is Australia's nuclear power. After the Federal Coalition led an honest and open debate about nuclear energy back in 2022, they had a landslide win in the 2025 government federal election, which led to Australia committing to nuclear energy and started investing and investigating and planning approvals for a nuclear power station, which is actually going to be, has been set up as a public-private partnership. Australia's first public-private partnership on a nuclear power station with IKEA as the industry partner. So, David, can you tell us a little bit about the economics of going towards nuclear energy? Is that good for business?
There will be a buck in it for someone. So, you know, I'm not going to rule it out straight away. I think everything's on the table. All of these things, there's a lot of naysayers, but I think, you know, you need a balanced evaluation of all of these possibilities. We're rushing too quickly to rule things out.
What about Dan? Where Sky News sit on the concept of Australia going nuclear?
Oh, I think it's fantastic. I think whilst they were much maligned, the builders behind the Corkman pub near Melbourne University are a good tender partner for the construction. And I think, you know, I actually think Melbourne University would be a good place to host the reactor so we can finally get something productive out of the university sector that we keep pouring billions of dollars into. Before we go on, I know that there are these inflection points where people think, oh, well, you know, we're on the wrong track here. And I remember that the koala, the extinction in 2030, I remember where I was when that was announced. And people focus very much on the cuteness of the koala. I think we all know deep down it is the stoned sex pest of the bush. And whilst obviously we don't have overseas tourists anymore, so it's less of an issue, but sometimes these events kind of divert our focus from the solutions that are available, which nuclear, cheap, easy to set up, and good for the environment, something we can all get behind. And I think Prime Minister Frydenberg doing a wonderful job in really laying the groundwork for those reactors in each major sandstone university.
Well, I just want to say that one of the wonderful things that I've been able to attend as the president is the opening of a lab here at the University of Melbourne. It is, in fact, the main income, it's provided the main income stream for the university. And what they've done is create a replacement for the extinct bee. And, you know, of course you understand that, you know, with the extinction of the bees, we couldn't propagate food. So a replacement had to be found for the bee, and these very clever scientists here invented a little mechanical bee operated by this quantum computer thing, and you know, it's really very successful in replacing the extinct bee. Now, you know, I was in two minds because it wasn't a native bee, but that they're all right in some areas of Australia, but what could I do? The European bee, you know, was so essential for most of our crops. Anyway, I did order the government to fund this centre, and there was a lot of grumbling about that, of course, but I think once the science was explained to them, they understood that, you know, their salads were at stake. I really admire this centre. They're doing great innovation, and I'm not a big believer in engineering and innovation solving the climate change problems, the mitigation problems, the adaptation problems. It's not happening fast enough, but I did just want to mention that one. And in fact, they've called it the quantum bee, I think. So anyway, the quantum bee is bringing in more money than all of the other businesses that the University of Melbourne has to run to stay open. And I just want to make it clear that, you know, the answer is not only nuclear power, but there are so many other innovations where our university system is stepping up, and it's thankfully to the young scientists who live underground and, you know, largely live in isolation, and in their, you know, long hours of isolation in their dungeons, they invent these wonderful things for us.
You're right, the quantum bee was a great contribution from science, but it did lead to Michael Crichton's science fiction novel Swarm being adopted into the syllabus to be studied in history. So, Chief Scientist Linden, science can sometimes seem to come up with the answer, but there can be unforeseen consequences sometimes. What do you have to say about that or quantum bee?
Well, I am also proud of the quantum bee, and I'm proud of the current generation of scientists that I represent. You know, we get paid less every year, we work underground, we're losing our great minds, we continue to lose our great minds to places in the Northern Hemisphere that are managing this 3 degrees of warming in a way that's a lot more equitable and has a lot fewer tsunamis, not no tsunamis, but fewer tsunamis. And I'm very proud of our generation of scientists and what we're doing. What I'm not seeing and where these unintended consequences come from is where an experiment or a breakthrough is made. We've got the quantum bee, of course, we've got our insect food manufacturing plants now, but they are taken and they are run away with by business without proper consultation about those benefits. So it's our job as scientists to have great ideas, to have great solutions. But then they're just taken away and they're run with without proper consultation, and that's where the problems lie.
Yeah, and I think you should mention the rogue company that stole the IP and went off and manufactured it in Vietnam, because what they brought back to Australia was not the quantum bee, and that's where the problem started.
Yeah, the quantum wasp. No.
Yes, that's right, and these companies have to be properly regulated. And that's on my agenda as well.
David, you're shaking your head. You're disagreeing.
There's occasionally a bad apple. That's true, but the majority of business is working for the people because.
The people in the business.
No. Where there's money to be made, where there's a market, the business can flex its muscle. I can hear a lot of pessimism in this panel, but it's about seeing a solution, and if there's a buck, we will chase it. And that will bring those solutions to your household, to your community. We're part of the solution. We're not working against you.
Is the solution for the future, though?
Mainly.
Well, as far as the things in your backyard go, going back to that nuclear power station on campus, Evangelia, you're rebuilding Queen's here. I guess on the positive, having nuclear power will go some way to helping Australia meet the targets under the Hobart Protocol, which was ratified at the UN Climate COP meeting in Australia, in Tasmania, in the late 2020s. But what do you think about having this in your backyard, and in fact the accusations that that's going to be the only bit of productivity at the university?
Well, seeing that Australia stepped into, considered nuclear energy so late, we're actually not going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 because nuclear power plants don't build themselves up that quickly. And so because of the quantum bee, the university has actually been able to stop the building of this nuclear power plant, seeing that due to all these natural catastrophes, we have seen that in Europe, for example, France in particular, with all their nuclear power plants, it has become such a dangerous source of power that the student body of the University of Melbourne, funded by the scientists who created the quantum bee, have been able to cancel the building process of this nuclear power plant because it was too dangerous for them. And with our floods, hurricanes, and all the cyclones entering Australia and Melbourne, there is no room for a nuclear power plant because the media, even though it doesn't like to cover all these deaths that are being caused due to the nuclear explosions and radioactive energy or waves that are entering parts of France, the student body, have decided against it.
And it's the premise of the debate is false. It's been at least 20 years since South Australia achieved energy, what's the word? Help me out here. Neutrality, right? Because they adopted green energy solutions to their energy. And again, it was Sky News that accused South Australia of causing a blackout across the country. Of course, that's not true, and lots of lies about all of that again. But I don't understand why our states don't adopt the South Australian model and become energy neutral and use green energy solutions. And I just want to say that of the top 200 green companies now, in the first 20, there are 14 Aboriginal companies, and I encourage you to join them because they have very good solutions for carbon emission reduction, energy production, and also living more simply and not depleting the world's resources. And it's entirely possible for each one of us to also be energy neutral and have almost no impact on the world's resources in the way that we live. And I urge you to have a look at those companies, but also remember that the rents that the University of Melbourne gets from exporting on short-term contracts their hives of quantum bees around the world means that almost the entire world food production is dependent on the quantum bee. And this is how the Australian economy will support more change. And unfortunately, what slowed down the quantum bee proposal for so long was, I'm sorry to say this, Sugden and Sky News, because they're not making a profit from it. And most of it operates as a foundation at the university, and most of the profits go to, of course, supporting science and innovation and scholarships. And so I really have to say that we need to listen to the facts. There's far too much of this InfoWars nonsense, and we all know that we've got about 13 years left before biodiversity, we reach the tipping point with biodiversity. Now, I go on about biodiversity, but we as the human species are part of the biodiversity system of the planet, and without all the biodiversity, our own species is in great peril. So we've only got 13 years. I keep saying this. In every presidential speech I give, I remind people of this. So I do encourage you to switch off Sky News, turn on Aboriginal radio. It's free, there are no advertisements, and you'll enjoy the music.
Sounds terrible. I think the reason is clear that we haven't moved to a South Australian model is that they have a cumulative 64% income tax once the new state income taxes are levied, that they've used to prop up these loss-making green technologies. Victoria, we've been blessed. Next to the Latrobe Open Cut Nature Park, we have the new mine that we opened to pummel brown coal into infinity, and we have, as a result, very cheap power that we use to produce more shipping containers. And I take President's point that it has certainly revitalised the area around Docklands, something I thought could never happen. But finally, people are living and enjoying life in that area. Sure, they're forced to live there due to a lack of available accommodation elsewhere. But you're seeing people making rational economic decisions, and the power is cheap. It is right there, given to us by Mother Nature, and we get to use it. That's wonderful for Victoria. That's a great benefit to this state to have such cheap power available to us. And we'll make the transition. We're doing that, but there's no hurry.
Yep. Well, coming back to the concept of information wars and an overload of information, Linden, the last IPCC climate change report seemed so far-fetched that the rights to the IPCC report were bought by Hollywood, and it's being converted into a movie called The Day After an Inconvenient Truth, I think. So there is a lot of fictional, non-fictional information out there. Is it a case of information overload, and how do we make sense of all this?
Yes, the 10th assessment report was a shame. Bringing in Michael Crichton to help with the media of that was probably a bad idea. He definitely subscribes to Sky News, and even though he's on his deathbed, he still managed to ruffle a few feathers.
Well, we can thank the reanimation of dead people.
Yes, that piece of
science came up with
technology.
for that,
Yes, that's true. Science can do great things, but also terrible things, and I think
That was the University of Sydney.
there is a lot of information, and we've known for a long time that climate change science is complicated in lots of ways because it affects lots of people. But it's also quite simple. We've put lots of extra energy in the atmosphere, and that's made the planet hotter. It's given more energy to our storms, it's given more power to our surf, and it's unbalanced, a balance that had been kept for 2 million years, pretty much, before we lobbed up, before Homo sapiens lobbed up, and we started burning coal in the early 1800s. And I think the Oscar award-winning IPCC film did its best. I think people are doing their best to try to communicate this science, but it's sometimes hard for us to listen, even now that it's on our doorstep, where we have these floating shipping containers in docklands, where we have this world that seems completely untenable. We can easily escape via social media. We can easily escape via super-fast internet and only take on what we need. And in some ways, that has led us to this situation where we were too scared to face this inconvenient truth. We left it for too long, and now it is too late. With all respect, President, you say we have 13 years, but that's 13 years to a completely grey planet with no biodiversity. It's already too late for lots and lots of things.
I don't like to add that part of the story because we have to give people hope. It may be a false hope, but I do believe that young people recognise what you've said as the fundamental fact of the matter, yes.
It may be false hope now in 2037, but if only back in the 2020s we had had this conversation and thought about these things, then we might have had a little bit more hope.
But scientists always have these doomsday scenarios. It was the population bomb, and then it was nuclear was going to kill us, and then it was the CFCs, and then it was climate change, which I'm still yet to be convinced on. But in each of these things, either the spectre of this doom didn't occur, or we solved it, like we did with CFCs.
Because we worked together as a planet. We didn't work together as a business.
Well, CFCs were called, obviously there's, the growing spectre of the one world government, which I do rail against on my 4 hours a day show, which I produce from my lawn skyscraper. And we obviously need to guard against that threat. But there's these constant over-talking and bigging up of these threats when we can see that the climate has been changing for a long time. And whilst, yes, there certainly do seem to be 1 in a 100-year floods every 3 months, which seems not mathematically possible. But, we are adapting in the same way we've always adapted.
I was rather inspired by the story of how the world solved the CFC problem. And, I was struck by how it was actually, I believe it was Richard Nixon and Margaret Thatcher that brought all the major countries to the table to sign off on the convention. And if only we had that kind of cooperation, if we had it in the recent past and if we could have it now, we could really tackle some of these climate change problems. I do believe that all of the coal mines in New South Wales need to be shut down. I'm not quite sure how to tackle that problem, but what I've done is formed a youth council, and I've asked a group of scientists to investigate the resolution of the CFC issues. I've given them all the facts via the scientific community on Australia's use of coal and petrol and oil and gas, and ask them to give me advice. So I'm waiting for the Youth Council to come back to me with advice. And I do hope that they get cracking, because I really do think they're our last chance to get some advice that's based on the urgency of the problem. You know, older people think, well, you know, I'm going to die, I've got my house, you know, I'm rich, and it's, you know, it's somebody else's problem. The young have been dealt a very bad hand. They don't own houses, they don't own cars, you know. As we know, everybody in the student population at the University of Melbourne is riding a bike or walking. They've got those scooter things. You know, it's really up to them to, you know, play a role now. They can't just, you know, sit on the sidelines on TikTok or whatever it's become. They have to, you know, be serious about making a policy input. Now, even while I don't have a residence in Canberra, because as I say, it was burnt to a crisp by several bushfire seasons, and I have had to move my residence to Melbourne. In fact, you know, it's out in the Dandenong Ranges. I do convene meetings on Zoom with people around the country, and I use a photograph in the background of what the ACT looks like now. It's tragic, but it's a reminder, and you know, it won't be long before every community in Australia will be demanding a voice. And I'm certainly prepared to use my emergency powers. So I encourage the youth to get on with it and use the council that I've established to, because I can't rely on the advice of business and the media. And you know, I have a certain responsibility under the Act under which I've been appointed. I take that responsibility very seriously. So over to the young.
Well, that's a very positive message, perhaps even to end on as we head to the late 2030s, but more importantly head towards 7:15 when we're going to have drinks. So thank you for that message of positivity. And it looks like we can finish, even though we've been talking about a lot of negative impacts and failure to act 15 years ago, we are heading towards a positive end with the country in very capable hands of President Langton taking all this action. And it does even sound like the government is being advised by the science and the excellent science of the chief scientist. The next generation is having more of a voice. And I know that Evangelia is also not just changing the title of the job master, but also playing the role that the college and the university plays in issues of equity and related aspects of shifts in power. Even David in the business area is starting to see that it's not just about the buck, that if there can be some synergies where the environment can benefit it as well. And although he's still got his Sky News channel, there were some signals that Dan might have been changing his mind at the end there. So I think we can possibly finish the hypothetical on a positive note, other than really there just being one unanswered question, and that is, who's going to play the lead in the sequel to the Hollywood IPCC movie? But we don't need to answer that. So I'd like to thank you all for coming here this evening, and I'd like to end by unmasking each of the panellists tonight and let you know who they really are. You of course know who most of them are, but Daniel Ziffer was a Wyvern. It was at Queen's in the late 1990s and covers Melbourne-based issues for ABC News. And is also fill-in presenter on finance, but he's also had a long experience in the media. He was previously the senior producer on ABC Radio Melbourne Mornings with John Fain. I think he was also a producer for Andrew Bolt, which might have led to some of the insights to what it's like to be a climate skeptic. So thank you very much to Daniel Ziffer for being part of tonight. And because I've introduced you your real self, do you have a final comment that's not hypothetical about what you really think?
It's very difficult having been in the media for 20 years and you think, maybe I should have done something else that could have helped people. I do think about it a lot. Climate change is one of those problems that is long and slow and hard. I do work in business and I am ever heartened that essentially whilst it won't be a complete answer, a lot of the answer is money. And through our decade of kind of chaotic responses to climate change politically, the money has just moved on. They just stopped caring about the Australian political scene and moved on. Big companies have international financing commitments that require them to be doing more and doing better. So they essentially decoupled from the people rolling around in the mud pit doing nothing and have already made substantial shifts. So I think we'll see more of that. It does require governmental action and at an intergovernmental level, but already there is action that is substantial, and I think as we've seen with what governments can do through COVID, there is potential for what you call a step change in our response. So let's see if that happens.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Next we have Evangelia Wichmann, who's this year's 2022 President of Queen's College. Thanks very much for participating. Evangelia was born in Germany, grew up in regional South Australia and has lived in Italy and France. And I guess looking at that sort of background, it's no surprise that she's researching international relations and politics, French, Chinese studies, and hopes one day to work in international relations to lead effective female empowerment and climate action. So, in light of that real-life activity, do you have a final comment?
So at the moment, I'm not as pessimistic as I will probably be in 2037. But yeah, I think I see there's hope, but it's definitely, the clock is ticking and it's ticking really fast. And on behalf of my generation, I think we are all very fed up that this has been dealt to us. But we hope that we can try and slow it down. And even though we've kind of given up on the 1.5 degree, maybe we can stop by the 2. Yeah, but yeah, I'm hopeful for the future, but time is ticking and we all have to act, not just the young ones, also everyone, all part of it.
Dr. Linden Ashcroft is also a Wyvern started here in 2003. She grew up in country Victoria on the lands of the Yorta Yorta people and is a lecturer in climate science and science communication here at the University of Melbourne. She's a superstar of STEM, a Victorian tall poppy, and has previously worked at the Bureau of Meteorology and managed a national citizen science project. So, Linden, do you have a final comment as your real self?
Well, I didn't actually think I was that far away from my real self when I was the chief scientist. A lot of the science that I talked about is in the latest IPCC report. You know, the projections are that things are going to get worse, and 3 degrees means a loss of so many of the things that we love, which means that the more we can act and the faster we can act, the more beautiful things we can save. I hate to agree with a Sky News presenter, but we are good at adapting as a species. We're good at working together. We're good at working as communities, and I wouldn't have this here if I didn't have a fierce hope that that will be able to happen.
That's great. Professor Marcia Langton was appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne in 2017. She's an anthropologist and a geographer, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and since 2000 has held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies here at the University of Melbourne. And in 1993, she was made a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of her work in anthropology and the advocacy for Aboriginal rights. Marcia, do you have a final comment?
Well, one of the things that made me think about this more carefully is a comment, I can't remember who made it. Basically, the science is in. Yeah, there'll be more science, but we know pretty much what's going to happen. But what we don't have a fix on is how are humans going to respond, and where are social sciences and humanities going to be useful in shaping our future as we deal with climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and hopefully reducing carbon emissions and keeping well, if we can get to net zero, we'll be doing well, but we're not going to, are we? So I was the chair of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Climate Change Policy Panel, You might remember the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility that Tony Abbott shut down. Lots of great scientists and social scientists, and we now don't have a national climate change body such as NCARF was. We did the research plan for Indigenous Australia, and there was also a lot of very good research. So have a look at the old NCARF site. It's archived, it's web archived. National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCCARF. We need another NCARF and a few other national bodies, and we better get cracking. But I think social scientists need to step up now, and we need better communication strategies. The doom and gloom strategy is obviously not working. I think the question of hope is very much, I think, at the centre of this. If we expect people to have hope for the future, then we better have some solutions, and the solutions lie in how we respond as human beings and as social beings. And of course that does mean, yes, relating well to business, to shareholders, shareholder groups, how our superannuation is invested, how do we stop the fossil fuel companies from wiping out life as we know it? Well, we better start using business and business acumen, investment, shareholder agreements and so on. We better start using every strategy at our disposal. So that's my view. Thank you.
And speaking of business, David Hyatt, who's also a Wyvern, started in Queens in 1983, works at AECOM, where he's Director of Environment. He's also been Director of Environmental Area for Ansett, which mustn't have ended well. And it might have sounded like a joke at the start that he was meant to be in the audience, but that's actually true. David got a phone call from me at 4 o'clock to say, would he mind stepping up onto the stage? So a special round of applause for David. And he may not have even had time to think about a final comment as his real self, but do you have one?
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah, it was great to be able to help you out there, Simon. But look, I think we've got a long road ahead. But I'm pretty optimistic in my day-to-day work. I'm working on the development of an offshore wind farm. I'm also working on the rehabilitation of a coal mine. So I see in my day-to-day that this transition is happening. It probably needs to go faster, and you know, there's going to be challenges along the way, but I'm really quite optimistic that there is momentum now and we are going to see this transition happen.
To conclude, thanks again to all of our panellists. In a moment I'll get you to join in again in thanking all our panellists, because they really didn't have a lot to gain and a lot to lose by participating in this sort of format of an event. So I hope through their efforts you've all gained something and have been challenged to think about where we are at this stage in history. So with that, I'd like to for you to join me in thanking the panel again.
Well done.
Before we conclude, I'll just hand back to Stuart. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks very much indeed, Geoffrey, and thank you for explaining to me what my legacy is going to be to Queen's, to introduce more wood panels and to see it burnt down at some stage in the next 20 years or so. That's terrific. I look forward to that and being recorded in the history books as someone that has created something that we're hoping to build for eternity. This has been a very serious issue this evening, and we do take it seriously within Queen's. In my time here over the last few years, with the backing of the council and with others supporting us, we have introduced a number of things around the college to help mitigate against some of the things that we've been talking about. So solar panels on Eakins and water fountains, so the students, rather than using plastic bottles all the time, can actually fill their bottles up from the water fountains, reprocessing food. We've got vegetarian days in college now, thanks to the current group of students that we have in the college and demand. So Tuesday is vegetarian day. But I think what we've seen tonight is that the climate issue isn't a single issue. The climate crisis isn't a single issue. It's multifaceted. It affects everyone's lives, and it requires a broad, cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary response to it. And we're actually in the best place to be able to come up with that within a university. Marcia knows that I keep coming back to talking about this Canadian senator who's First Nations, Murray Sinclair, who says that our problems came with education and they will go with education. And I think it's the same with the climate change area, that much of what we have inherited came through the Industrial Revolution, and we entered into the phase of fossil fuels and everything. And the answer to all of this will come through education. From agriculture to education to public health and everything in between, I think universities are very well set up to come up with the solution, but we need to all work together. And as Marcia reminded us, we need to work across disciplines. This is one of the things that we're also trying to do at Queen's. I think it's one of the extraordinary things about colleges, actually, that students come together across disciplines and talk about these big ideas. Thank you for stimulating us tonight to think again about this crisis that we're in our world at the moment. And could you please just join me again in thanking the whole panel, but particularly Jeffrey at the end there, Simon, who has been talking to me about this for about a year, I think now, and it's nice to see it come to fruition. Thanks, Simon, for all the work that you've put in, and thanks everyone else, and thank you, the audience, for turning up this evening.